People, what was your worst experience with someone while being intimate? I decided to hook up with a girl. I pull up to a super sketchy neighborhood with drug deals happening openly on the street. I went to the door, and the girl answered, looking just like her pictures. The house was in rough shape, filled with garbage, and had a strange, burned plastic smell. We went to her room, and as things started, she asked me to grab her melons to make sure I wasn't a cop, at least. Her melons were huge and looked very nice. I handed over the money, and we began. But just a minute in, I heard a child's voice calling from another room, saying their food is here and asking who was in there with her mom. The mom tried to brush it off, but the kid kept pressing. Meanwhile, I'm standing there, totally awkward, and feeling like this was going downhill fast. The mom left to calm her child, so I quickly grabbed my clothes and hid in a closet, hoping to avoid more weirdness. After some back and forth, the kid came into the room and spotted me in the closet, trying to cover myself with my clothes. She looked about 9 or 10 and simply said, "What kind of crap is this?" before leaving the room. Then, I heard her on the phone saying, "Pops, how fast can you get here? There's a white dude totally naked in our closet." That was my cue to get dressed as fast as possible and leave. I had to pass by them on my way out, and I awkwardly apologized, saying, "Sorry, this was a huge mistake," and bolted for my car, trying to avoid eye contact with the people hanging around outside. At that point, I didn't care about the money. I just needed to get out of there. To this day, I'm still not sure if I just had the worst luck ever, or if this was some kind of hustle that this chick and her daughter ran for easy money. Story 2. About 20 years ago, I was living with my girlfriend, and we decided to adopt a dog from a shelter. The dog had clearly been through some tough experiences, likely due to mistreatment from a previous owner. One evening, my girlfriend and I started getting intimate while the dog, Charlie, was lying on a pillow near the headboard. Just as things were getting heated, Charlie suddenly became agitated and, before I could react, he lunged and bit me right near my eyelid and eyebrow. The pain was intense, and there was blood everywhere. I honestly thought he had seriously injured me, possibly even taking my eye out. I ended up rolling around, trying to get control of the situation, and eventually had to pry his mouth open to free myself. Next thing I knew, I was in the emergency room getting stitches and explaining to the doctor what had happened. It wasn't exactly a fun night. After getting patched up, we went home, and I was determined to finish what we started. While I was recovering, I did manage to continue our night with my girlfriend, not the dog. Charlie and I eventually became good friends, but he definitely had his own boundaries. Story 3. Around 10 to 12 years after high school, I found myself newly single and decided to reach out to a girl I had a crush on back in middle school and freshman year. We met up for drinks, had a good time catching up, and called it a night. About a week later, after a few drinks, I sent her a text suggesting we get together for some fun. Not my best decision, I admit. Surprisingly, she agreed and said she'd come over after work in about an hour. I spent that time cleaning up my place, eagerly anticipating what was to come. This was the girl I had admired for years, and I was feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. When she finally arrived, we went to my room, and things started off awkwardly. We managed to get into bed, but once she removed her clothing, I noticed a strong smell of sweat. Understandable since she'd just gotten off work, so I tried to brush it off. For the next 30 minutes, things didn't quite go as planned. I struggled to even get things started. No matter the position, she kept saying it hurt, and I could tell something wasn't quite right. So I just decided to stop and told her it was late and I had work early. She agreed, and we both just kind of went along with it. As I was getting dressed, she casually asked if I had taken care of things before we met, then commented on how I wasn't very long but certainly girthy. It felt like an insult, honestly, and I wasn't sure how to respond, so I awkwardly laughed it off. She asked if I'd text her the next day, and I said I would, but I never did. Instead, she posted something on Facebook saying, "Well, that was a waste of time," and it got one like. Story 4. My first experience with intimacy was a bit of a disaster. My boyfriend at the time and I had been dating for a few weeks, and he had this odd way of treating the most basic gestures like they were huge acts of kindness. He would open the door for me or grab my coat and then hype up how amazing he was for doing those things. He once even said, "You won't find many guys as great as I am these days." He also loved bragging about how skilled he was at pleasing women, but when it came to the actual experience, he struggled. He spent 15 minutes trying, but I didn't feel any pleasure, just a lot of pressure and nothing else. He got frustrated and suggested we move upstairs. He positioned me awkwardly and tried again. Still, I felt nothing but discomfort and pain in my legs. I must have looked bored or expressionless, and he seemed offended. He suddenly pushed really hard once, missed completely, and ended up hurting himself. He accidentally hit a sensitive area and bent himself, yelping in pain. I was completely confused, as this was my first real experience. After he recovered, he started getting dressed, telling me he was going to leave. I was genuinely worried about him and told him to be careful in case he'd hurt himself. The next morning, I woke up to a breakup text. He said, "Come on, you have to admit we didn't feel anything." I thought he meant physically, which was true for me, so I said, "Yeah, true, I guess." But he was talking about emotionally, which I didn't realize at the time. Later, I learned that I am asexual. Looking back, I think he just didn't understand that taking someone's V card isn't supposed to be a big, glamorous thing. It's about learning and figuring things out together. Eventually, I met someone kind, gentle, and understanding who didn't mind my low drive. He made me feel comfortable, and eventually, I wanted to try again. That time, things were different, and it was amazing. We had fun, tried new things, and genuinely enjoyed being together. Now, we're married, going on 6 years, and while my drive isn't as high as his, it's still great when we do connect. Story 5. Back in college, it was a late night, and I was feeling particularly lonely and impulsive. I matched with a girl on Tinder who, while not the most attractive, made her intentions very clear from the start. She was saying all sorts of bold, explicit things, and I figured, why not? At the time, I didn't have a car, and my roommate, who usually let me borrow his, was out at a party. My only option was my bike, but the catch was that she lived about an hour away. It was already 12:30 a.m., and biking that far seemed ridiculous. Still, my urges got the better of me, and I decided to go for it. The ride was brutal. By the time I arrived at her place, I was out of breath, drenched in sweat, and already questioning my life choices. She opened the door, took one look at me, and immediately said, "My son is asleep inside. Let's go across the street." Confused but too far in to back out, I followed her across the road to an elementary school. She didn't bring anything with her, no blanket, nothing. So we ended up sitting in the damp grass. Without much fanfare, she lay back and said, "Let's go." We started, but right away, I started noticing things. Her breath reeked of cigarettes, and she wasn't putting in any effort. She just lay there like a statue, moaning loudly, while I did all the work. I was both embarrassed and paranoid that someone nearby might hear us. To make things worse, the exhaustion from the bike ride hit me hard, and my legs started cramping painfully. Somehow, I managed to finish, though I made the mistake of doing so without a protection. Definitely not my proudest moment. As soon as it was over, she lit another cigarette, said, "Thanks, that was amazing," and walked back to her house without another word. I was left lying in the grass, leg cramping, covered in grass stains, and full of regret. Eventually, I got up, got dressed, and started the long bike ride home. That's when my front tire popped. I called my roommate, who was still at his party, and explained what had happened. He burst out laughing, but immediately left to pick me up. He threw my bike into the trunk, grabbed some McDonald's for me to help me recover, and took me home. After that night, I decided to take a long break from Tinder and seriously reevaluate my decision-making skills. Story 6. When I was about 18, I went back to visit my old childhood neighborhood after my family had moved to another state. While walking around, I ran into a girl who still lived there and remembered me from when we were kids. We started talking, and things escalated quickly in a way I wasn't expecting. She took me to a bedroom, lay back on the bed, and, to my surprise, revealed she wasn't wearing any inners. I was completely caught off guard. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that in real life, let alone been in a situation like this. I was so nervous and excited that as soon as I reached out and touched her, I, unfortunately, finished right then and there. She looked at me, clearly annoyed, and stormed out of the room without saying much. I was left sitting there, feeling completely embarrassed. At the time, I was still a virgin and had never experienced anything like that before, so I had no idea how to handle it. That moment stuck with me as a pretty humbling memory from my younger days. Story 7. I was going through a rough breakup and decided to hit a party, fully determined to drink my sorrows away. My goal for the night was simple: get as drunk as humanly possible and forget about my ex. I was chatting with people, being friendly, but I wasn't expecting anyone to show interest in me. I wasn't exactly hiding my mission to drink myself into oblivion. At some point, I stumbled outside and ended up throwing up all over the garden. Classy, I know. After that, I rinsed my mouth out, not with water, mind you, but with Jack Daniels, and made my way back inside. To my surprise, a girl walked up to me and started making out with me. Yes, she had definitely seen what happened in the garden moments earlier, but it didn't seem to bother her. I was so drunk that I barely processed what was happening, but I managed to find my friend, the host of the party, and told him about it. He gave me a look and said, "All right, mate, I think it's bedtime for you," before taking me to one of the bedrooms and putting me to bed like the good friend he is. What I didn't realize was that the girl had spotted me leaving and followed me. She was in the room next door. In my drunken state, I decided that going to her was a great idea. I stumbled into her bed, and she wasted no time getting things started. But almost immediately, I realized that I was way too drunk to follow through. After an embarrassingly brief attempt, I gave up, rolled over, and went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I had no idea what I'd walked into. It turned out there were two other people in the bed the whole time, her friend and one of mine. Apparently, they had been trying to hook up themselves, but my drunken antics completely ruined the mood. They told me it was hilarious watching two drunk idiots fumble around, but ultimately, I managed to make it a bad experience for all four of us. Story 8. While staying in a hotel with a girl, we were both into BJ exploring limits and pushing boundaries. One night, she sat on the floor with her back against the wall and gave me a very direct request to be more aggressive. She told me she'd let me know when to stop by giving me a signal, but otherwise, I should go all out. I was all in, but as I was getting into it, things didn't go as planned. Without any warning, she suddenly got very sick and ended up vomiting. It wasn't her fault, but it was definitely a messy situation. I ended up standing in the shower afterward, trying to clean up as best I could, and dealing with the aftermath wasn't pleasant. After we cleaned up, we checked in with each other and decided we both still wanted to continue, but we decided to take it slower this time. We opted to just relax together and enjoy some gentler intimacy. However, when I was touching her, I noticed she was incredibly wet, which I thought was a good sign. But then I realized too late that she had actually started her period. That required another quick trip to the bathroom, and after that, we both decided it was probably best to call it a night. It wasn't the kind of experience I expected, but I learned a lot about communication and boundaries along the way. Story 9. Shortly after my wife and I got married, we had one of those peaceful, slow-paced mornings together. As we were enjoying some early morning intimacy, the landline started ringing. Since most of the calls we received were either telemarketers or people mistakenly dialing the number of the phone line's previous owner, we decided to let it go to the answering machine. Moments later, we heard the familiar voice of my mother-in-law coming through the speaker, delivering some unexpected news. My wife's grandfather had passed away during the night. Needless to say, the mood shifted completely. Nothing quite kills a mood like hearing a family member just passed away. Story 10. I once went to the movies with a girlfriend I had been dating for a little while. At that point, we were still getting to know each other, and our relationship was in that exciting phase. The theater was pretty empty, and during the film, she leaned over and whispered that she had always wanted to try something a little daring in public, and thought this was the perfect chance. I gave her a playful nod, not quite sure what to expect but intrigued nonetheless. To my surprise, instead of being subtle, she got right to it immediately. After a moment, I quietly mentioned that things were feeling a little dry, assuming she might adjust or change tactics. Instead, she spit into her palm and went right back to business. She repeated this a few times, all the while nuzzling into my neck and whispering little things that made the moment feel even more intense. When I reached the peak, it was intense. I hadn't even realized at first what a mess I had made. When she finally stopped, I glanced down and realized the situation was going to be tough to walk out of unnoticed. She looked down too and immediately admitted she hadn't thought that far ahead but promised to fix it. Before I could process what she meant, she left the theater and came back a few minutes later holding a cup. She pretended to trip as she approached me and dumped the cup's contents all over my lap. At first, I thought it was just water or soda, but within seconds, I realized it was hot, greasy popcorn butter. Did I mention it was hot? I yelped from the pain, and she immediately started apologizing. A few people in the theater turned to look as I awkwardly stood up, trying to compose myself, but between the heat, the mess, and my overly sensitive state, I was in no shape to be calm. As we left the theater, I could barely walk straight, my pants stained and uncomfortable in more ways than one. On the way to the car, I asked her what on earth she had been thinking. With a sheepish grin, she explained that the butter looked enough like a plausible excuse for the mess and thought it would help me avoid embarrassment. At that point, I couldn't help but laugh, even through the discomfort. Believe it or not, I ended up marrying her. Moments like that, as crazy as they were, made me fall for her sense of humor and spontaneity. Story 11. One evening, my then-girlfriend and I found ourselves in a borrowed car, parked in what we thought was a quiet spot at a closed shopping center. The atmosphere was calm, and we figured it was a safe place to spend some time together without interruptions. Things started to heat up, and just as we were getting into the moment, barely a few seconds in, there was a sudden tap on the window that made us both freeze. I turned to see a police officer standing outside, looking thoroughly unimpressed. I scrambled to compose myself, fumbling to adjust my clothes while my girlfriend sat there, red-faced and mortified. The officer didn't ask for an explanation, or even seem remotely interested in giving us a lecture. Instead, he just sighed, looked at the car, and then turned to my girlfriend with a mix of disbelief and pity. "A Pontiac? Really? This is what you agreed to," he said, shaking his head. Then he directed his attention to me, adding, "Get your pants on and go home." The situation was beyond embarrassing, and while we avoided any serious trouble, no warning, no ticket, the officer's sarcastic comment about the car stuck with me. It was impossible not to laugh about it later, though my girlfriend needed a little more time to see the humor in it. Story 12. One summer, my girlfriend and I stayed at a beachfront condo that had a beautiful balcony overlooking the water. One evening, things started to heat up, and she suggested we take advantage of the view. There was a nice lounge chair out there, plastic, but still looked decent, and she thought it would be perfect for us. I had my doubts and mentioned that I wasn't sure the chair could handle both of us, especially if things got energetic. She waved off my concerns and insisted it would be fine. Reluctantly, I agreed, but as soon as we got into it, snap, the chair gave out under us. After recovering from the shock and a few laughs, we decided to continue on the balcony itself, which had been my preference from the start. It all worked out in the end, but the broken chair was a lingering reminder of our misjudgment. The next morning, her parents arrived at the condo, and her dad walked out onto the balcony, surveying the area. His gaze landed on the snapped lounge chair, and he asked, "How'd my new chair break?" Without missing a beat, I owned up to it. I apologized profusely, claiming that I was clumsy and clearly didn't understand how to properly use a chair. Thankfully, he didn't ask too many follow-up questions and just shook his head at my supposed carelessness. The chair might not have survived the night, but at least my dignity stayed mostly intact, mostly. Story 13. I once hooked up with a coworker I'd been vibing with for a while. Things were exciting at first, but it quickly turned into an unexpected experience that I wasn't quite prepared for. This was the first instance I had with a woman who had perhaps watched too much porn. She was too rough with my wand. She kept yanking on it as if it wasn't attached to me. She would shake it and then smack it on me or her chin, hard. She would then mutter some nasty and go at it again. I'm all for a bit of adventure and roughness in the right context, but that's the kind of thing you usually talk about first to make sure everyone's on the same page. Eventually, it became too much to handle. I couldn't just grin and bear it, so I faked a sudden realization that I'd forgotten something important and ended things there. My poor anatomy was sore for over a week afterward. Story 14. I was hanging out with this girl, and things started getting a bit more intimate. As she was getting more involved, I placed my hand on her head, not realizing that she was wearing a hat. As I gently touched her, the hat shifted, and to my surprise, her wig moved along with it. It was my first time realizing that her hair wasn't natural. I let out a small gasp, which immediately caused her to quickly adjust her hair and put everything back in place. The whole situation became awkward, and I just couldn't continue. While she stayed the night, the next morning I noticed that $50 was missing from my wallet. It wasn't the best experience. Story 15. It was a brief, first-time encounter, and I was trying to be attentive, focusing on giving the guy the attention he seemed to enjoy. As I was going down on him, I kept hearing these soft whimpers, which made me think I was doing well. I felt encouraged, continuing on as best as I could. At one point, I glanced up to check his reaction, and what I saw completely threw me off guard. He had tears streaming down his face, and, to my shock, he was flipping through what appeared to be his grandmother's obituary. Story 16. I met up with a guy who seemed confident and kept talking about how big he was, particularly how girthy he was. When things got going, I quickly realized that his claims didn't quite match the reality. Not only was he much smaller than he had made it sound, but I also figured that his size might have affected the overall experience in other ways. On top of that, he made a bizarre comment about wanting to turn me into a human Twinkie, which didn't help the situation at all. It turned out to be one of the most disappointing encounters I've had. After he finished, I tried to take care of things myself, but then he started going off about his job. He's an elementary school teacher, which was not what I needed at that moment. I ended up blocking his number as soon as he left. It was just not the kind of experience I was hoping for, and I didn't feel the need to keep it going. Story 17. I was 20, and my girlfriend was 19 at the time. Her mom struggled with alcoholism, often spending her evenings in bed, watching reality shows and drinking. Because of that, we had a lot of privacy at her house, and it wasn't unusual for us to spend time together in her room when her mom was busy. Although the door didn't have a lock, her mom never intruded, so we didn't really worry about it. Well, one day I'm over there, and one thing leads to another, and I'm lying there in her bed the pooing while she was giving me a blowy. Just as we were getting into it, the door creaked open. I quickly pulled away and scrambled to cover myself, feeling both surprised and a little awkward. Her mom stood there for a moment, staring at us, almost frozen in place, before asking if her daughter had seen her purse. She then politely suggested that if we were going to spend time together, maybe we should do it in the living room instead. We agreed, but after waiting around for a few more minutes to see if her mom would leave, we decided not to move to the living room. In the end, we didn't follow her suggestion, but things did eventually resume, and we carried on with our private time. Story 18. I met a girl on Hinge during the pandemic, and we both agreed up front that we were looking for a no-strings-attached situation. We were on the same page from the start, so I drove over to her luxury apartment complex, which was really nice. She was attractive, and everything seemed great. We didn't waste time. She was very direct and started giving me blowy right away in the living room, which I was obviously enjoying. After a little while, I felt it was time to take things to the next level. I undressed, got behind her, and as soon as I did, I was hit with the most overwhelming, unpleasant odor. It was so bad that I immediately lost my momentum. I felt awkward, trying to think of a way to make it seem like it was somehow my fault, but before I could do anything, she started criticizing me, which just made the whole situation even more uncomfortable. I quickly got dressed, left, and drove off, feeling a little embarrassed. Despite everything, I somehow walked away thinking it was my fault, even though it clearly wasn't. It was definitely one of the more awkward experiences I've had. Story 19. I was with a man I had a strong friendship with before things got physical. We had fooled around a bit and were both unclothed, lying on the bed. He was a little shy by nature, but I didn't mind, as we were comfortable with each other. We got into position, and as soon as we started, he froze completely. He had his hands on my hips, but there was no movement, no response. I tried signaling him to move, but nothing happened. It felt incredibly awkward and uncomfortable. He just stared at me, his hand still holding me in place, but not responding to anything I did. He didn't go soft, but he also didn't move or speak. It didn't go anywhere, and after a while, if I tried to move, he seemed upset. He didn't want me to get dressed or leave the bed, and even got upset when I went to the bathroom. He wanted me to stay there and just listen to music with him, but it felt like we were stuck in an uncomfortable situation. It was hard to understand, and it left me feeling confused about what he wanted. Story 20. I was hanging out with a male coworker, and we were pretty close. We would often smoke and play games, just having a good time together. One day, we were in my apartment, enjoying some time playing Jenga and getting high. Out of the blue, he asked, "Wanna bang?" I paused for a moment, but I figured why not, so I agreed. It turned out he had a very slender and long one, which I could barely feel unless he hit my inner circle, which was actually quite painful. He started sweating a lot, even though the room wasn't warm at all. He was trying hard, using my head for leverage, and honestly, it was uncomfortable and a bit awkward. Sweat was dripping all over me, and I didn't know how to react. After what felt like an eternity, he finally stopped, saying he was tired and apologized for sweating so much. I asked if it usually took him a long time to finish, and he said, "Yeah." I then asked when the last time he did it, and he mentioned it had been a long time and that he'd only done it once. After that, he left, and I took a shower. Looking back, I wish we hadn't done it because we were really good friends before, and things just felt a bit off after that. Story 21. I got together with this guy I had a lot of tension with after working together for years. We finally decided to get intimate, but it didn't go as smoothly as I had hoped. Every time we started getting into it, he'd stop after a few moments, pull away, and start pacing around the room, leaving me just lying there, confused and wondering what was going on. Then he'd come back and we'd start again, only for him to repeat the same thing over and over, about 20 times. It became so uncomfortable that I couldn't take it anymore, so I just got up and left. Story 22. I had a one-night experience, which was the first and only time I've ever had casual hookup. I was grieving the loss of a partner and wasn't looking for anything at all. I was just sitting in a bar, trying to distract myself. But a really attractive girl approached me, and despite my initial resistance, she was very persistent. Eventually, she convinced me to take her back to my place. We got intimate, and at first, I started to feel a little better about it. She was kind, patient, and understanding, which made it more comfortable. Things were going well, and it became very sensual and tender between us. However, things quickly took an unexpected turn. For reasons I still don't understand, she poked my bottom. The shock of it caused me to jump up in surprise, which broke one of the legs off my bed. I fell back into a heavy piece of furniture, and it collapsed on me, knocking me unconscious. When I came to, I was surrounded by paramedics. One of them, with a big grin, said, "You've had quite the night, haven't you?" The girl had called an ambulance when she couldn't wake me up and had put a facecloth, of all things, over me. To this day, I still don't fully understand what led to that moment. Story 23. I was in the middle of a moment with my girlfriend when the phone started ringing. I reached over to turn it off, but didn't pull away. Her roommate was outside and answered, then walked in with the phone in hand. We froze for a second, and she just stared at us in shock, saying, "It's for you," still holding the phone out. As she took a step closer, I instinctively moved a little toward my girlfriend, accidentally bumping her stomach, which caused my dong to go all the way in. She wasn't expecting it and let out a loud, startled sound. Like when you're pushing something difficult. It happened right as the phone was still on. Her roommate, embarrassed, slapped the phone out of her hand and told her to get out. Turns out, it was her boss on the other line, trying to see if she could pick up a shift, and she had the phone on speaker in her office, so other people might have heard. Definitely one for the books. Story 24. I drove to a larger city about 1.5 hours away and decided to try one of the apps. As a gay guy, it's usually pretty easy to find someone for a casual hookup. I started chatting with a guy who seemed attractive based on his profile, and we made plans to meet at his place. When I got there, he told me to just come in because the door was unlocked. As soon as I walked in, I noticed a bunch of energy drink and soda cans scattered around, and he was already in bed with the lights off. The first thing I noticed was the strong, unpleasant odor. He really didn't smell good. I still decided to go for it, and I started engaging with him, but he had trouble staying hard. After a few minutes, I ended up leaving. The worst part was that the smell seemed to cling to me during the entire drive back home. No banging, just an uncomfortable 1.5-hour drive with that stench, and I couldn't wait to shower once I got home. Honestly, if you're going to hook up with someone, take a shower first. Story 25. When I was 18, my girlfriend lived in the basement of her parents' house, which was set up like a small apartment with its own entrance. It had a living room, bedroom, bathroom, and even a craft room/office. However, the house was built cheaply, so we could easily hear conversations from the room above us. We had to keep the volume low on the TV, and her parents would often ask us to turn it down. Her parents were very religious and had strict rules. I wasn't allowed to stay over, and when I visited, we had to keep the basement door open. One weekend, they went out of town, and although they told her I wasn't allowed over, they asked a neighbor to keep an eye out for me. At this point, we had been together for about a year and had been intimate before, but we usually found other places to be alone. This weekend, however, we had the basement all to ourselves and 2 days of uninterrupted time together. We had been planning for it and were really excited. I snuck over to her house, parked a few blocks away, and entered through the backyard. We spent the day together, watching movies and being playful. But after we finished, we went upstairs for a snack and a drink. To our shock, her parents had come back early from their trip. They were sitting on the couch. Her mom was crying, and her dad was staring at me in disbelief. Realizing the situation, I quickly got dressed and left through the back. I ran to my car, still partially dressed, and drove away. I didn't talk to her for almost a week. When I finally heard from her, she told me her parents had sent her to a retreat, and she was now required to break up with me. Her mom had thrown away all our things, including the movie we'd rented, which really stung since it was an expensive rental. Story 26. I once snuck out to meet up with someone I had met online. We agreed to meet in the parking lot of a local high school, planning to hang out in his car. Things were going fine until we saw headlights with flashing lights pull up. We thought it might be the police, so I quickly got dressed and went to talk to the officer. He told us to move, so I suggested the guy follow me in my car. As I started driving, I realized he had taken a different turn, and my phone was still in his car. I spent a couple of hours driving around looking for him but couldn't find him, all of this happening around 2 a.m. I went home and tracked my phone, finding its location at a house about an hour away. I sent him a message saying to return the phone or I'd call the authorities. I saw the phone's location moving, but then it stopped for an hour. At that point, I decided to go after it. I wrote down directions and drove over there, arriving at 5 a.m. I spent a while ringing doorbells and checking cars, but couldn't find it. Eventually, my parents woke up, and I told them my phone was missing. We went looking together and found it discarded on the side of the road. Story 27. I had an intense experience at a music festival back in 2016 after using a strong substance. I ended up losing track of my friends, and everything was fine until I ran into a girl I had been involved with years earlier. I told her what was going on, and she was kind enough to invite me to spend the rest of the night with her and her friends. When the festival ended, I had no real plan and my phone was dead, so we ended up going back to her house. As time went on, the effects of the substance became stronger, and eventually, we ended up being intimate. However, things got overwhelming when she started making strange noises, which made me feel uneasy. At one point, I switched positions, but it felt surreal, and I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The experience became too much for me, and I quickly got dressed and left. I never spoke to her again after that. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.